Good afternoon. My name is Ethan Orr. I'm an associate professor and the associate director for the Arizona Cooperative Extension and the interim director for the Natural Resource Users Law and Policy Center. I have two subject matter experts with me today. We're going to be talking about hydrology, mining in southern Arizona, and good neighbor agreements. I'd like to introduce Tomas from the South 32 Hermosa project. Tomas?
So I'm principal hydrogeologist with the South 32 Hermosa project. I don't know how much.
That's good.
So
that's it. In time, my dear friend from hydrology.
Yep, I'm a professor in hydrology and atmospheric sciences.
Well, I guess the one question, Tomas, just to kind of open it up, tell us about South 32 and tell us about what's going on with the community down there.
So with regard to the South 32 Hermosa project, it's a zinc, manganese, lead, and silver ore that we're building a mine. It's a project currently, and we're working towards actually constructing all of the features associated with the mine. My specific role within the project is I'm in charge of the baseline hydrology studies. And so I've interacted with the community associated with various questions on water resources and groundwater management.
And Ty, you're kind of a subject matter expert in hydrology, and I know that's a big issue with every mine, right? But what is your role?
So with this project in particular, we're almost piloting this idea of a hydrologic intermediary. So that's somebody that sort of sits between the mine and the community and helps to translate some of the technical things back and forth. I think it also provides an opportunity for you to share some information that I can help to understand the hydrology while keeping that information sort of protected. So I think it's a nice liaison there.
Since knowledge is power, you're basically an access point for the broader community to understand what hydrology.
Yes, but entirely powerless.
Yes, exactly. Information is power in this case. Well, Tomas, can you walk me through what is the hydrological modeling process that we're going through?
It's a good question. You step through it in kind of a conceptual way first. So you gather a lot of information associated with essentially all of the hydrologic system. So you walk through where all of the water is coming from and where all that water is going within the hydrologic system. So that includes looking at water levels within groundwater wells, looking at stream flow, looking at seeps and springs throughout the region, looking at riparian areas and what type of vegetation is there. And so you develop this conceptual model of all of the inputs, the precipitation, stream flow, melt, recharge components. And then as you develop this understanding of the conceptual hydrologic system, then you can put that into a numerical modeling software or program so you can simulate that within a computer system. And so then that's when you can walk through and develop an understanding of and recalibrate based on what you observed in kind of the natural world versus what you're able to simulate in a computerized environment. From there, then you run sensitivity analyses and do calibration, and ultimately you have a product that you can move forward with to simulate future conditions. Some of the things that we've actually been able to do is actually look at uncertainty. There's a lot of things that we know and we've measured, and there's a whole lot of things that you really can't measure all of them. And so we've walked through and collected uncertainty analyses where we're actually varying different parameters in the model to see how that would influence future projections of groundwater management.
That's incredibly robust. And Ty, as we do all this modeling, can you walk me through the pros and cons of, because we have a public that sees their kind of something, and it's an iterative process. So what are the pros and cons of using these scientific models that come out with different variants and then working with multiple stakeholders?
Yeah, I think it's almost all pros, I would say, but there's room for misinterpretation or lack of understanding, perhaps. And so I think the groundwater system is such a black box to most people. It's not something they would have dealt with. So I think you can spend a little bit of time and get people to have an understanding of how, taking water out here takes some time before it will propagate to somewhere else, right? And then you can sort of start to say that what controls how far and how fast that response goes depends on all these properties of the medium that we really rarely have a chance to measure. And so then you can start to get this idea that there are uncertainties because of our lack of measurement and some of the simplifications that we have to make. So I think it helps people to understand that while these numerical models are the best that we can do to describe the situation, they shouldn't necessarily look at them as an exact predictor of what's going to happen. And I think that's where it's really nice to be able to work together in this kind of group to say, uncertainty, often when we talk about uncertainty, it seems like a negative. Like, well, you predict this, but it has this much uncertainty. But we can sort of turn that around and say, we have narrowed the uncertainty from not knowing anything to knowing something within bounds. And now you can start to say, are those bounds enough for us to make a decision? Or do we need to get together and figure out, where do we need to do more work to narrow those uncertainties so that we feel comfortable making this?
No, that makes a lot of sense, and it takes us down the road. So, Tomas, from a company standpoint, from the South 32 Hermosa, what is your perspective on using a hydrological intermediary? Have you seen the pros and cons and benefits of having kind of an interpreter whenever you speak to the public?
Oh, yeah. I think that there is value in having that hydrologic intermediary because within mining, it's a very dynamic environment. There's a lot of things going on. And one of the things that's challenging is because of that change, communicating that to the public in an effective way is challenging. And so having a hydrologic intermediary that can translate not only the technical component, but also recognize the complexities of kind of the scientific aspect of things, and then be able to communicate that with the community. And then I think also the value there is having the ability to translate community concerns back to South 32. And so, yeah, we have had a positive outcome with regard to that relationship.
I mean, I had to say that, right?
Yeah, say I hope you better say it. But I guess that brings me to the broader question, back to Tomas, because this is kind of an interesting and exciting body of law where we're talking about good neighbor agreements or basically agreements with the community, not just on communicating hydrologically, but in all sorts of areas. I mean, it could be viewshed, or it could be noise pollution or roadways. And I know you can't speak to the specifics of what South 32 is doing with the community because all the basically three community partners and the mine have to speak as one, which I think is very healthy. But can you speak to them broadly and more generally in the mining industry? Do you see them as useful, and is there any refining that you would do as they go forward?
That's a big question. But,
and we'll follow up with Ty's thought on that too.
So, in general, a good neighbor agreement, and in this case, the community protection and benefits agreement, is a legally binding agreement between Santa Cruz County, the city of Nogales, and the town of Patagonia. And what are the typical components associated with that type of an agreement would be associated with commitments that South 32 would make to the community, potentially associated with monitoring and community benefits, employment, various aspects of transparency in sharing information with the community. And so all of those sorts of things would be the typical types of things that would be associated with a good neighbor agreement.
That makes sense. And Ty, I see a really a valuable role for the university. You're representing us in this case because we're the land grant, and our job is to make knowledge accessible and accessible for people. How do you see a land grant university, your role with hydrologists, but even other specialists fitting into these types of agreements?
It's a good question. I mean, I think the hardest thing with this whole process is trust, right? And establishing trust. And I think that both parties will come in, perhaps typically with a little bit of awareness. And I think that any way that you can have an actor who really can sort of stand in the middle and say, I'm going to try to deal with this objectively. Like, I don't really have any horse in this race at all. And I'm going to try to explain the concerns that you have and help you to explore them so you can prioritize those things that, maybe you just shouldn't bother worrying about. And then, if you have concerns that you don't think are being, treated fully, then I can help to express those in technical terms so that we can try to get you to some solution. And I think that's true of whatever domain expert it might be, right? That we're bringing the knowledge without sort of the baggage, hopefully.
So I guess to build on that question, what are some of the challenges that you have, and what are the challenges in kind of filling that, in this case, hydrological intermediary role or an intermediary in other fields as well?
Yeah, I mean, I can speak to this role. So there are a lot of concerns that the community may have, and some of them may have to do with water, but they're not necessarily something that's going to be answered by a model, right? It's not, that's not part of the system that's modeled. And so helping them to distinguish between, you know, where do they go for answers, or where do they place these questions, and what really are the roles of models and what are not, or hydrogeologists in general. Hopefully it helps them to navigate, you know, going to the right place for the answer.
That makes sense. And I guess, Tomas, I guess the question, as we're building out these models, you have a community that is permanent. And, you know, one of the things that I've observed in the mining industry, and you know this very well, but there's multiple companies that are usually be involved in one site. You'll have the geological company that's usually involved in the discovery, and then usually a junior that almost turns it into a turnkey and finally brings in the operator. And so many times, if I'm a mayor or if I'm just a community member that's concerned about a view shed or water contamination, I start to engage with one company that's really turning it over to another company that's turning it over to another company. How can the community best interface with that, and how can a good neighbor agreement kind of help facilitate that?
A lot of other good questions there.
I just ask them. You're the expert.
So I think it's a sensitive situation, right? So the community wants to understand what's going to happen in the future. And so with that dynamic nature of kind of the mining industry as a whole, there's different economic analyses, there's pre-feasibility studies, there's feasibility studies. And as you step through each one of those, plans change, right? So you're exploring the entire time, you're doing drilling, you're getting more information about the ore body. And so what used to be the case over, you know, a year ago or even a week ago is now changed.
Copper could go up or down.
Exactly. And then sometimes the case, you have maybe a different design about how you would access the ore. And so from a water management standpoint, you have to rearrange how you're going to design a water management strategy for each of those phases of a design. And so what you would want to have is ideally something relatively concrete before you go to the community and say, hey, this is what's going to happen, because things do change so often. And so it becomes very, very sensitive in how you bring those pieces out to the community because of that potential for change, and then having to communicate the change in addition to just the technical aspects of a particular project.
That makes sense. So Ty, you being kind of, again, you're the face of science in many cases. What have you learned, and what are some of the insights that you've taken? Because oftentimes you'll have people that see things, they're concerned about things, and they go to you and they see the model, but they also ask for you to interpret and kind of.
Yeah, it's been a fascinating process, and I think, you know, one of the things that's interesting as a scientist is this recognition that, you know, some of the knowledge and some of the data that South 32 will generate, they are legally bound to keep that in, not to share it, right? And that's sort of from a purely scientific point of view, we don't deal with that usually, right? And so understanding, you know, how can you respect that and sort of hold to that, whereas you're still trying to communicate to the community that, you know, you don't necessarily need to know these specifics in order to be able to answer your question. So in a way, it's sort of doing science in a different way. It's where you're not really encouraged or allowed necessarily to say everything that you know, but you're trying to find that middle ground where you're communicating what's important or what you think is important.
I could see that takes a great deal of discretion.
I think so. Yeah.
You're privy to things that this community legally can't know at this point.
Right.
And so you can't share that, but it almost feels like you have an allegiance to the science and the process.
Yeah, and I think that's true. And I think there's I think it's a role that can be played by this intermediary, where you say, you know, you are going to interpret some of these things and be a little bit of a firewall so that you can have the open discussions that you may not be able to have with the community directly for those reasons. And I can sort of help to filter out and say, you know, if they really need to know this, would it be okay to tell them this way or something like that? So yeah, it's been fascinating.
So Tomas, to build on that, South 32 has been involved heavily in the Santa Cruz and Nogales community in a myriad of ways. Have you found this hydrological mediary? What has been your perception on the public response to some of the things that are out there. And the reason I say that, as I mentioned before this, I come from an old mining family, and I remember stories from my grandfather and father in the bad days of the 50s and 60s when things weren't quite as good now. I mean, we're really doing a much better job focusing on end of life and environmental sensitivities. But there's a lot of fear out there whenever you say mine, water, contamination. You said, how has the intermediary changed, or has it changed, the perception of the community and the conversations in the community?
Yeah, it's a good question. But some of the things that Ty just mentioned associated with developing that relationship of trust, I think it has to go on both sides, right? So it has to be a capable individual that everybody kind of recognizes can do and interpret some of the technical side of things, but then also have trust on both ends.
Yeah.
Gratefully, I've had a good relationship with Ty through my academic career, and so then we've had a personal trust in that regard. But then when you start talking about the community, I think that there's been a lot of positive response in having Ty involved in that process, because he does have the ability to step away from the process, not being too tied up into it, but to be able to see both sides of the project and be able to communicate those essential pieces to the community, and then also to be responsive to the community as well, to say, hey, these are things that we need to communicate to South 32, and then as South 32 we can respond to those. So I think it's been a positive, at least as I've seen with the community, in terms of having that hydrologic intermediary to make that communication transition there.
So moving a little bit from perception to reality, I know Hermosa is already doing some things, because the concerns that I hear are the standard that you hear with any mine: depletion, contamination, you're going to give me a third eye. What are some of the things that Hermosa is doing to really protect the water table, both in terms of depletion and contamination, because you have such a beautiful riparian area right in Patagonia?
So the activities that we're involved in, we have a pretty robust groundwater monitoring system. So we have 80 different sites throughout the Patagonia Mountains within the community that we monitor for groundwater levels. And about a subset of those, we're collecting water quality samples on a quarterly basis. From the Seeps and Springs side, we've actually got a quarterly program where we do wet-dry mapping throughout the entire region, so that we have good baseline information, and on a seasonal basis we collect water quality samples. So we have a good understanding of the baseline conditions, and then we have the monitoring in place to identify changes in water levels, groundwater flow, Seeps and Springs flows, things like that. And so in terms of understanding what could happen, what kinds of impacts may happen, we have that system in place to be able to evaluate that. In terms of protecting the water quality, we have a water treatment system on site that is state-of-the-art treatment, that we take water from the site. So our water management program goes through the water treatment plant and then is discharged back into the environment. It meets all of the ADEQ standards associated with being able to discharge into that type of environment. So we work with the regulators, of course, and then we have a monitoring program to keep those things protected for those people that are in the community.
That makes sense. Now, and Ty, one of the things, you work with the Community Advisory Board, and I'd love to find out more about their role and their interface. But also, you have the tripartite, the three main, Santa Cruz, Nogales, Patagonia, involved, but you also have a lot of other stakeholders, almost ancillary partners like state parks or the Nature Conservancy, or even us here at the U of A. And one thing that we're credible with the U of A, every survey has basically said the University of Arizona is the most trusted and credible source in Southern Arizona. And so you go in with a great deal of trust, but how do you build on that with your community advisory, and how do you communicate to kind of these secondary stakeholders?
So I haven't, to be honest. I mean, my role has really been specifically to work with the panel. And I think, to the degree that I've been able to establish trust with the panel, I think it's always being willing to answer questions as honestly and forthrightly and completely as I can. I think, and then also you can take a bit of an advocacy role. So for instance, we talked about what we haven't implemented yet. how do we explain to the stakeholders and have them have input into, say, designing this monitoring plan, right? So, you could take, for example, a springs, and again, as we said, you start drawing down water, and it takes some time for that effect to be felt at some distance. So it's possible that by the time you see that impact, it's already pretty late, right? And it's hard to do something about it. So, how can we use this model or this suite of models to say, before you saw a change in the spring, you would see this, or you may see this, and helping them to understand how you're being really actively proactive about trying to avoid damage rather than document damage. Does that make sense?
That makes perfect sense. And you're right. You don't want to catch something 5 years from now when you have such, again, a riparian area and a public lake. So I guess one thing, kind of expanding the question for both of you, you mentioned broadly some of your monitoring things. Are there any specific technologies that either of you would like to share, or any specific things that Hermosa's doing, working with community areas, even vineyards with the wine, or anything along those lines?
Specific technology, that's a good question as well. One of the things that obviously I mentioned the water treatment plant, but some of the design for the facility itself is actually reducing the amount of water that we're consuming at the site. And so while we have a process for groundwater management, mostly for health and safety, to protect those during the development and the completion of the mine itself, that's really moving water out of the way, and that's part of the reason why we've put that water back into the environment. As part of the mine plan of operations, we've proposed the use of recharge basins within the Patagonia Mountains. Again, trying to keep that water in close proximity to where it's been withdrawn, but then it can recharge back into the system. So that's a component of trying to protect the water resources more generally. In terms of the water use, the application of a dry stack tailing program reduces the water use significantly compared to a lot of other mines, and such that we have about 0.6 gallons of water use per ton of ore produced, whereas a lot of mines have something on the order of 6 to 7 gallons per ton of ore. And so we've really tried to cut back on the application of water on site. There's not nearly as much dust control that would be required, say, for an open pit facility. But then we also have a lot of recycling circuits to take back that water and be able to reuse it within the system, as opposed to having to continually have it make up water into the system.
Makes sense.
Yeah, so I started my life as a geophysicist, so we're always dreaming of having the tool that we can fly over and see exactly what we want to see. And the problem is that what we're looking for are often really subtle features. So what's the nature of fracturing, or what's the nature of a fault, and we just don't have the technology to do that. And I would say that one of the most advanced things that we can do actually is building out not just this one model of a site, but this suite of models that we can say, any one of these models matches our data acceptably well. So what we'll often talk about is, we build out these 5 models, let's say, or 5 versions of a model, and maybe one of these models really leads to some outcome that's of concern. And so then we can use this suite of models to really target what we should be measuring to try to check the viability of this model against the others. So it's not really a technology as much as it's an approach or a way of thinking about the problem.
So building on that with the lessons learned, again, for both of you, and this starting with you, Ty, you've done this, and as I mentioned, there's a lot of moving parts with any time you're developing a mine. And you mentioned kind of almost the proverbial canary.
Right.
If you see this is a concern.
Yeah.
First part of the question, as the intermediary, do you feel that you have the relationship to go back to Hermosa South 32 and say, this is really troubling, we need to fix this and course correct?
Right.
And then the other part would be for other mining companies or other communities that are engaged, what advice would you have in setting up this model?
I don't know that I have, I know I don't have an authority to go back. I mean, I think, we have enough of a history and good relationship that I can go to Tomas and say, this really concerns me, right? And we've done that in the past, and he's let me look at the model that was developed for the mine outside the area. that they're working, and ask questions about it. So I think that going forward, I really think that baking this whole process in at the beginning, and sort of as Tomas was saying that you want to have something concrete that you say, we're going to go all the way from educating the public about the hydrologic processes to identifying their concerns and translating them into what can be modeled, to how do we use that to help them to understand the monitoring as an active way to alleviate or avoid problems. So I think the more of that can be baked in at the beginning and committed to, the better.
That makes sense. Yeah, Tomas, kind of the same question from you're the end user in this property, and you're also the developer. But what would be your advice for anyone that wanted to build kind of a good neighbor, or again, a community that was concerned?
Yeah, it's. I think communication is probably one of the key elements to developing a positive relationship with the community. So as early as you can start to communicate with the community, let them know some of the ideas, some of the plans, that's going to be incredibly helpful with regard to that. Also, being able to branch out to different sectors of the community. I think it's important that we look at all of the different aspects of the community and reach out. In the case of South 32, we've had not only the community advisory panels, but we've had the opportunity to work with a number of the tribal communities that have a connection to this land historically. And it's been a really positive outcome with regard to working with different members of the community, and then working with individuals, being able to have mine site tours. So a lot of the construction that's been going on at Hermosa has been able to be tracked by the community to where we have monthly tours at the site so that they can become familiar with the processes. And that communication has probably been the key element that either has been positive because we've done it, or if we haven't done it effectively, then that's been kind of the negative piece. And so that's really where I would recommend that people start with that communication.
So Tomas, building on that point, I know South 32 has been incredibly engaged in the communities down in southern Arizona. Tell us about some of the other things that you've done, the mine tours, some of the schools, but what else have you done in the Nogales and the Santa Cruz community?
Well, I think there's been a lot of community outreach with regards to activities that the South 32 Hermosa has participated in, different events that we've been able to sponsor or to help out with different educational systems. Well, I can't speak overly knowledgeably about it, but also Centro is a facility that is going to be constructed in Nogales that would be able to support job creation within the community, but because of the technology that's available, actually being able to remotely operate equipment at the mine site from a location at a distance. And so that facilitates a lot of new opportunities for the community in terms of employment.
In fact, I just like hearing the percentage. What percentage of those jobs are going to be above ground?
I can't really speak to the number, so I'll have to defer on that one.
Okay.
But
I will say the community is very excited about that, because you're right. These are very good paying, high tech jobs that you're running equipment remotely.
Yeah, definitely.
So I guess as we sort of wrap up, Ty, do you have any final thoughts on the project as a whole, or anything else in terms of good neighbor agreements or advice for future projects as this goes forward?
Yeah, I think the concept of a good neighbor agreement is just so solid, right? This idea of trying to get people in to identify these possible sticking points early, apply science to them, give them this whole slate of choices that they're having to make, because none of these decisions is single dimension, right? So I think the more that can happen, the better. But it also feels like that trust is really easy to lose, right? And so it has to be continually managed, and a lot of communication, and a lot of, I think one thing that I've found really helpful is, there's a sense that sort of from the outside, that the higher you go in South 32, the less there's less direct the communication and connection with the community, and so having somebody embedded who is a hydrogeologist and is also at the meetings and talking to people, I think that's critical, right? I think if it weren't for a person, and sometimes you take heat, you're sort of the face of the company, and you do that well, but I think it's absolutely critical to have somebody who's there and stays there and has that knowledge and that.
And helping, giving the public the tools to look behind the curtain.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, most people, if you give them hydrological numbers, they either don't know or they don't trust you.
Yeah, and or they have not, that's not their specialty, right? So they haven't been prepared to understand it. Yeah, so that's easy to distrust. Yeah,
It's kind of the same question. I mean, what would you, for these other companies that are kind of developing it? And I think about, almost 3 decades ago when I worked for the Tucson City Council, and we were dealing with the Home Depot, and people get excited. And I remember sitting there with the vice president of Home Depot, and the neighborhood had put things together and they would explode. And so I had neighbors, about 50 neighbors, screaming about exploding stores. And I still remember this look of shock. He's like, our stores don't explode. And I'm like, but, and I'm not saying that's occurring in this case. It occurred in that case where you have emotion that the rules logic. And so what kind of advice would you have to kind of tamper that down? Because there are things you can't share. And there are things that even if you shared it, even with me, I mean, my doctorate's not in hydrology. I'd probably be lost at the turn. How do you communicate with that?
Well, actually, I really like the point that Ty made in terms of having some of the individuals there that can communicate through time.
Yeah.
So you develop trust not as a one-off, right? It usually requires you to show up multiple times to be able to hey, I've seen that guy before. And so I think that's an important piece to the communication, is having somebody there that they're used to seeing, that they can address concerns to, and that they feel that the concerns are being addressed or responded to. And so having that corporate knowledge of being not only technically savvy within the subject matter, but then also being able to have the corporate knowledge of these are the decisions that have been made that led us to this point. And so sometimes that can be an element in this, is helping people understand that history, because sometimes you walk in the middle like, well, why are we doing this? And it's like, no. This decision was made here, and then this decision, and it's led us to this point in time. And having that continuity of understanding can kind of help with that communication, even with the community, and then going back even within the industry itself to say, there's a whole lot of decisions that made this pathway, and that's why we're here today, as opposed to trying to revisit and kind of rework some situations.
Well, gentlemen, I really appreciate your time. Are there any final thoughts as we close?
No, I'm glad that you're shedding a light on this. I think it's I think it's a really, really valuable way for communities and companies or multiple actors to come together and try to be proactive and avoid problems rather than try to deal with them. I think it's great.
Nuts?
Agreed. I think this is a great way to communicate some of these opportunities that future industry has in this space.
Yeah. Well, again, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Tomas, Ty, and again, my name is Ethan Orr. I'm the interim director of the Natural Resource Users Law and Policy Center. I'm trying to be part of the University of Arizona and help explain and advocate for natural resource users and public law. Thank you for your time.
Thanks.
Thank you.